ERP implementations often turn into money pits, but they don't have to be this way. That's what I want to talk about here today. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world reach the third stage of digital transformation success. And being tech agnostic and independent means that we help clients with their digital transformations in a way that is meant to help manage their ERP implementations to keep them on track, on budget, and to ensure that they're managing their overall project the way that they should. And one of the biggest challenges and the reasons why so many projects fail is because they go over budget. They end up spending a lot more than expected. In fact, it's estimated that anywhere north of 80% of ERP implementations spend too much on their implementation and fail to get the expected results from their project. So what I want to do today is talk about what are the things you can do to ensure that you're managing your ERP implementation, managing the budget, going in with realistic expectations, and ensuring that your project does not turn into a massive money pit. And be sure to stay tuned till the end of the video because I'm also going to share the real reason why so many ERP implementation budgets get blown out of the water. Let's talk about the reality of implementation cost estimates. This is probably the first step in a blown ERP budget, is at the very beginning before the project ever starts. Simply put, the organization and the project team, along with their software vendor and their system integrator, will come up with an implementation cost estimate that simply isn't realistic. And the reason for this isn't because anyone's trying to mislead necessarily or because they don't necessarily know what they're doing. It's because they miss a lot of different costs, a lot of hidden costs that happen during an implementation. And they also have a number of assumptions that are inaccurate or unrealistic. I'm going to come back to the assumption point here in just a moment, but for this segment, I'll talk a little bit about how broken the implementation estimate process is. And again, the reason for this is because software vendors typically come into a project and they provide an implementation budget based on their direct cost. They'll have a pretty good estimate of what the software is going to cost. And typically that's the easiest thing to budget for, is the software cost itself, because that's the one thing you can predict with a fair amount of certainty, depending on what you buy, the modules you get, the number of subscriptions that you buy. All that stuff has a pretty cut and dry answer as to what it's going to cost. Where things get tricky though is when you start to budget for all the unknowns. All the things like the technical implementation costs and some of the hidden costs behind an implementation. So when you look at a full total cost of ownership, you can't just take your software vendor's implementation costs and assume that that is your total project cost, because you have a bunch of other costs and a bunch of other investments you have to make as part of the project. And that's where companies get into trouble. And along with that is the fact that there are inaccurate and unrealistic assumptions typically driving an implementation estimate. And I'll come back to that here in just a moment. But the first thing to understand before we get into cost assumptions is that typically implementation costs are incomplete and they're unrealistic when you start a project. And the key is, and the thing I want to talk about through the rest of this video, is that you have to have a realistic budgeting process up front, and you have to have a realistic understanding of what those costs are before you ever start. And once you do that, then you at least have a chance of ensuring that your project stays on track. One of the trickiest parts of budgeting for an ERP implementation is understanding and making sure that you have realistic assumptions behind the budget. So for example, a lot of times when we go through a project and we see a vendor's cost proposal, they'll have a number of assumptions or disclaimers in their proposal or in their contracts that say that, for example, they are not going to be responsible for something like data migration. That might be a simple line item on a statement of work, a simple one-line assumption, but that one-line assumption can have a massive impact on your overall cost. If the vendor is not going to do the data migration for you in this example, then who is? And what is the cost associated with that? And by the way, not only is there a direct cost associated with that data migration example that I'm giving you here, but that data migration example will also impact the vendor's implementation timeline. And when you impact the vendor's implementation timeline, you're also impacting their budget. So you've got to look at how this all ties together, and you have to look at the whole picture to start the project and make sure that you're not just looking at vendor's direct costs, but that you're looking at the entire program. And when you look at the entire program, you're going to uncover a lot of different costs, a lot of assumptions that may be unrealistic from the vendor. And if you don't have this realistic understanding of the scope and the assumptions behind it, then you don't have a realistic understanding of what the budget is. So it's really important that you challenge assumptions, you understand what the assumptions mean, and oftentimes it helps to have someone who's independent and tech agnostic that doesn't have anything to gain from you believing the assumptions that are in the proposal without questioning them and understanding what they actually mean to your overall budget. So understanding those assumptions is a key part of making sure you have a realistic budget to begin with. Another trigger for budget overruns and money pits in ERP implementations is when organizations fail to find the right balance of outside consultants and internal resources to support their project. Oftentimes what happens is an organization finds that they don't have enough resources to commit to the project, and because they don't have enough internal resources, they end up relying more on the outside consultants, which causes their budget and their costs to increase over time. Not only that, but when you have less people committed to the project internally, chances are pretty high that you're going to make decisions slower and that you have less ownership of the project, which also leads to cost overruns. So this is another really important dynamic you have to look at, is making sure you understand what the realistic resource needs are and making sure that you can accommodate those resource requirements. And this is tricky too, because oftentimes the software vendor and the service providers supporting the software vendor want to get started on the project right away. Once you've signed the contract, they have a vested interest and an economic interest in starting sooner than later, even if you're not ready, even if you haven't mobilized your internal team, and that leads them to more revenue and it leads to more mismanagement of their time, and you're the one that's going to be on the hook for that extra time. So it's really important that you understand the balance and make sure you have the right amount of resources before you start the project. And if you need to put off the technical implementation or put off the technical service provider until you have those internal resources lined up, then you should do that. And oftentimes the technical provider hasn't given a lot of clarity as to what you should have on the project, and that's where an independent advisor like Third Stage Consulting can help. So finding that right balance between internal and external resources is one of the other ways that you can ensure that your implementation does not become a money pit. Now, once you have a realistic budget for your project, it still doesn't mean you're out of the woods. It still doesn't mean that you're guaranteed to finish your project on budget. Now you've got to manage that budget. You've got to have the right project governance and controls in place. And guess what? The only person that can really provide those governance controls are you, the implementing organization. It's not going to be your technical service provider, nor should it be. You don't want someone who has something to gain by selling you more hours and more billable revenue. That should not be the same party that is responsible for managing your overall budget. Not only that, but your technical providers, your software provider, and your technical consultants are just one work stream within an overall program. So you need someone that manages over your software vendor, your system integrator, your reseller, whoever it is that's managing the technical aspect of your project. You want that overall program manager to manage the technical resources as well as the change resources, the process improvement people, the architects, the data migration team, the integration between third-party applications and the new system. All that stuff has to be managed under one big program umbrella, and that program manager, that should be an internal person that stewards the company's money and has a vested interest in ensuring that they manage to a budget, those are the people that should be managing the budget. And there are going to be times where you've got to really clamp down on the software providers and the technical providers to ensure that you're getting the value that you should be getting out of the project. So one thing I highly recommend before you start getting into a project, and certainly before you bring the software vendor and the system integrator in, is to make sure that you have a project charter, you've got a PMO in place, you have the program management in place, you have the project governance and controls in place, and make sure you have that in place and a solid foundation to manage the project before you start bringing in the army of consultants from the outside. And that's another service that Third Stage Consulting provides to our clients, is ensuring that we act as an extension of the client's project team to help them set up a PMO, to help them manage and provide governance and controls to ensure that the project does not turn into a money pit. Now, I want to talk for a moment about the real reason why implementation costs spiral out of control. Why do so many of these projects turn into these big money pits? It's typically not simply because there's not the right governance and controls in place, although that can lead to it. It's typically not because the software vendor or the system integrator doesn't know what they're doing, although there's arguably a lack of accountability there. But the real reason is because of these unrealistic expectations that organizations have going into the project, and unrealistic assumptions, which we did talk about earlier in this video. But I want to unpack this a little bit because it's such an important point. Because what oftentimes happens is if a software vendor comes to you and says, for example, they can implement a new technology within your organization, let's just say in 12 months. They can get it done in 12 months, and this is the budget for it to happen within 12 months. Now, the reality is it's highly likely that 12 months is not realistic. You as an organization are not going to be able to change that fast. You're not going to be able to make decisions fast enough, no matter how hard you try. And maybe it was never going to be 12 months, but it's more likely to be 18 months. And if you don't know that up front and you draw a line in the sand and set a budget based on a 12-month implementation, when that 12-month implementation turns into 18 months, you didn't just lose time, you're also losing a lot of money because your run rate is going at a certain pace, assuming that you're going to do this project in 12 months. And your software vendor and your technology providers have staffed up the project to go at a certain run rate to accommodate a 12-month timeline. So when the 12-month timeline turns into 18 months, it's pretty likely that not only did you go over time by 50%, but your budget's probably going to increase by 50% as well, because now the project team didn't get throttled back or scaled down along the way as the project got delayed. They staffed it up for a 12-month implementation and they kept it at that high run rate throughout the entire 18 months. So that's why you have to understand, if it is actually going to be 18 months in this example instead of 12 months, you need to budget and plan for an overall plan that is an 18-month duration, even if that means you need to scale back the run rate on a monthly basis or a quarterly basis for your outside consultants. So having those realistic understandings, not only of the budget itself, the direct budget, but also just the overall program plan and the overall project plan, and making sure that's all tied together and realistic, that's the real thing you can do to avoid the money pit that most organizations fall into. So I hope this is providing some guidance and understanding of how to avoid making sure that your ERP project does not turn into an implementation money pit. If you'd like to learn more about best practices and tips on how to ensure your project is successful, I encourage you to read our book called Lessons from 1,000 Digital Transformations. And in this book, we unpack 20 different things that successful organizations do differently than those that fail. And I encourage you to download that. You can scan the QR code right here to read it or go to the links below. I hope you found this information useful and hope you have a great day.